On the night of January 19th, 2017, a quiet neighborhood in Placentia, California, was pierced by the sound of gunfire. It was just after dusk when 35-year-old Robert Rios stepped outside his modest home. To neighbors, it was an ordinary Thursday evening. But within moments, Rios would collapse on the pavement, mortally wounded. His killer vanished into the darkness, leaving behind only shell casings and the echo of violence. Police arrived to find Rios gravely injured, lying just steps from the front door he had left minutes earlier. Efforts to save him failed. At the scene, family members and neighbors stood in shock. One described the horror as like something out of a war zone, but it was right here, in our community. To the public, Robert Rios's murder seemed sudden and senseless, but to investigators it carried the hallmarks of an execution-style killing, calculated, precise, and tied to something far bigger than a single dispute. Who was Robert Rios? Born and raised in Orange County, he was known by friends as loyal, hardworking, and protective of his family. But like many caught in the orbit of Southern California's underworld, Rios also lived a life with risks. He had connections to the local drug trade, a shadow economy that operated in the neighborhoods of Placentia, Anaheim, and Santa Ana. For law enforcement, that connection would become the critical thread in unraveling the mystery of his murder. Detectives soon learned that Rios wasn't just a random target. According to investigators, he was killed for a specific reason. He had stopped paying taxes. This wasn't the kind of tax owed to the government. It was a street-level extortion fee demanded by the Mexican Mafia, or La M, one of the most feared prison gangs in America. For decades, the Mexican Mafia has controlled Southern California's drug trade from behind bars, imposing a tribute system on anyone who sells narcotics in their territory. Dealers must hand over a portion of their profits. Those who comply are allowed to operate. Those who resist face violent consequences. Robert Rios, prosecutors allege, had stopped making those payments, and in the brutal calculus of the Mexican Mafia, that defiance had only one outcome: death. For the Placentia Police Department, the investigation was immediately complex. This was no ordinary homicide. It bore the signature of a gangland hit, one likely orchestrated by powerful figures far beyond the streets of Orange County. Witnesses were reluctant, fearful of retaliation. The Mexican Mafia's reputation for enforcing silence was legendary. Detectives knew they were dealing not just with a murder, but with the possibility of a conspiracy stretching into California's prison system. The case soon drew in federal and county investigators. They began piecing together fragments of phone records, surveillance, and confidential informant statements. Slowly, a picture emerged. Robert Rios's murder was not the work of a lone gunman. It was part of a larger criminal order, one that reached into the high-security cells of California's prisons. At the center of it all was one name: Johnny Martinez. At the time, Martinez was serving a 15-year-to-life sentence at Salinas Valley State Prison. But even behind bars, authorities claimed, he remained a shot caller for the Mexican Mafia, a man whose orders carried the weight of life and death. Using a smuggled cell phone, prosecutors alleged, Martinez issued the command that sealed Robert Rios's fate. For Rios's family, the news was devastating. Not only had they lost a son and brother, but the explanation for his death was even more chilling. Their loved one had been executed because he had run afoul of a powerful prison gang. The killing shocked Placentia, a small suburban city that rarely made headlines for organized crime. But in truth, the violence was part of a much broader pattern, a grim reminder that the Mexican Mafia's influence extended well beyond prison walls, reaching into neighborhoods and lives across Southern California. Robert Rios's murder would prove to be more than just a local tragedy. It would expose the inner workings of one of America's most dangerous prison gangs, and it would set the stage for a years-long legal battle, one that would test the limits of law enforcement, the courts, and the pursuit of justice in the face of organized crime. To understand why Robert Rios was murdered, investigators needed to look beyond the crime scene in Placentia. His killing wasn't just about a neighborhood dispute or a drug deal gone wrong. It was about an invisible tax, a shadow system of control enforced by one of the most violent organizations in America's prison underworld, the Mexican Mafia. Known simply as La M, Spanish for the letter M, the group emerged in the late 1950s inside California's prison yards. What began as a prison gang designed to protect Mexican-American inmates soon transformed into a sophisticated criminal enterprise. By the 1970s and 80s, the Mexican Mafia had built an empire stretching far beyond prison walls, commanding loyalty and fear from street gangs across Southern California. The cornerstone of their power was the tax system. Here's how it worked. Anyone selling drugs in neighborhoods under La Im's influence had to pay a percentage of their profits back to the Mexican Mafia. These taxes weren't optional. They were enforced with the same ruthless efficiency as any government levy, but with far deadlier consequences for those who refused. Prosecutors described it as a mafia-style protection racket. Dealers paid their dues in exchange for permission to operate. In return, they received not only access to drugs supplied by the organization, but also a measure of safety. But if they failed to comply, the punishment was swift and severe. Beatdowns, stabbings, shootings, and in cases like Robert Rios, death. For decades, this system thrived because it created a pipeline of money flowing from the streets into the prison cells of La Im leaders. Even while locked behind bars, the Mexican Mafia remained in command. Their word could dictate who lived, who died, and who controlled the lucrative narcotics trade on the outside. The taxes weren't limited to individuals either. Entire street gangs fell under La Im's authority. Local gangs like the Sureños, loosely organized neighborhood groups throughout Southern California, often acted as foot soldiers for the Mexican Mafia, enforcing orders on the outside. In exchange, they received the gang's backing inside prison, where survival often depended on allegiance. It was a self-reinforcing cycle. On the street, La M collected money. In prison, they provided protection. And for decades, law enforcement struggled to disrupt the system because the gang's leaders were shielded behind prison walls. Robert Rios, detectives concluded, had stopped making those payments. Maybe it was defiance. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe he thought he could step out of the Mexican Mafia's shadow. Whatever the reason, it marked him for death. By 2017, the Mexican Mafia's reputation for enforcing its rules was legendary. To disobey was not just a risk, it was a death sentence. Law enforcement officials have described the gang as operating with corporate discipline, where defaulters are eliminated to set an example for others. One prosecutor explained it this way: "It's not about the money from one person, it's about the message. If one dealer thinks they can get away without paying, others will follow. That's why they kill, to maintain fear, to maintain order." This system of taxation wasn't unique to Rios's case. Over the years, investigators documented dozens of killings across California, linked to unpaid taxes. Victims ranged from low-level dealers to rival gang members, all punished for crossing La Im's invisible line. What made the Rios case especially chilling was that it was allegedly ordered from hundreds of miles away by a man who was already behind bars. Using a contraband cell phone, Johnny Martinez, prosecutors say, issued the directive that Rios had to die. The killing outside his Placentia home was the physical manifestation of La M's power, a signal that their reach extended from the prison cell to the suburban street corner. For the community, Rios's murder was a wake-up call. It showed how deeply entrenched the Mexican Mafia's tax system had become. An underground economy where street-level dealers were merely pawns in a much larger game. For investigators, it was proof that the prison gang's influence was as strong as ever, even as law enforcement poured resources into dismantling it. But the Mexican Mafia's grip on the drug trade was not just about violence, it was about psychology, about creating an aura of inevitability. Every gang member and dealer knew the rules, and when Rios was killed, it reinforced the ultimate lesson. No one was beyond reach. Robert Rios's death wasn't random. It was a calculation, a punishment carried out under the shadow of La M's tax system. His killing would shine a spotlight on how prison gangs use fear and violence to maintain an empire. And it would bring investigators to the man they believed gave the order, Johnny Martinez, the shot caller who controlled lives from behind prison walls. When detectives traced the threads of Robert Rios's murder back to a California prison cell, one name stood out, Johnny Martinez. At first glance, Martinez was just another inmate serving out a long sentence, 15 years to life at Salinas Valley State Prison, a maximum security facility known for housing some of the state's most dangerous men. But behind those prison walls, Martinez was more than a convict. According to prosecutors, he was a shot caller for the Mexican Mafia, a man whose voice carried deadly authority. The Mexican Mafia operates like a shadow government inside California's prisons. Leaders, often called carnals or brothers, don't need freedom to wield power. Instead, they govern through networks of loyal foot soldiers, both inside and outside prison walls. Orders flow through coded letters, smuggled notes known as kites, and in more recent years, contraband cell phones. For Martinez, investigators allege the cell phone became his weapon of choice. Hidden away from guards, these devices allowed Mexican Mafia leaders to communicate instantly with associates on the streets. From inside his cell, Martinez could dial up soldiers in Orange County, issue commands, and orchestrate violence as if he were free. And according to law enforcement, that's exactly what he did in the case of Robert Rios. Prosecutors believe Martinez learned that Rios had stopped paying taxes. To the Mexican Mafia, that kind of defiance could not go unanswered. Martinez allegedly picked up his contraband phone and set the gears in motion. Through calls and messages, he directed trusted associates to eliminate Rios. What makes this chilling is not just the act itself, but the efficiency with which it was carried out. Rios's murder wasn't impulsive. It was planned, communicated, and executed under orders from a man locked behind concrete and steel. Law enforcement officials say this is how La M maintains its grip. Even when their leaders are incarcerated, their commands ripple outward, enforced by a network of street gangs that act as their enforcers. The prison may confine the body, but not the influence. Johnny Martinez's path to becoming a shot caller followed the trajectory of many Mexican Mafia leaders. He rose through the ranks by demonstrating loyalty, ruthlessness, and an ability to command respect. Over time, his reputation earned him influence, and eventually the power to issue orders that others were expected to follow without question. In prison culture, that authority is absolute. Disobedience can mean death. Martinez's name carried weight, and when he declared that Rios had to be removed, the decision became final. For investigators, cases like Martinez's highlight a persistent problem. Contraband phones. Despite efforts by prison officials to block signals, these devices continue to slip through security, smuggled by corrupt staff or visitors. Once inside, they become lifelines for criminal organizations. A single phone in the hands of a gang leader can control drug routes, extortion rackets, and murder plots. That was the reality in January 2017. From Salinas Valley, Martinez allegedly reached into the heart of Placentia and signed Robert Rios's death warrant. To law enforcement, this wasn't just about one killing. It was about proving that the Mexican Mafia's leadership remained active and dangerous, even in custody. Charging Martinez with murder would send a message. The walls of a prison are not a shield from justice. But going after a Mexican Mafia leader is no simple task. Their operations are shrouded in secrecy, their communications layered with code and intimidation. Witnesses are often too terrified to testify. Even experienced prosecutors face uphill battles trying to secure convictions. In 2018, Orange County District Attorney Tony Racketeering stood before cameras and announced charges against Martinez. He accused the inmate of orchestrating Rios's killing, framing it as part of a broader strategy to dismantle La M's control. For a moment, it seemed the justice system had finally cornered one of the gang's most dangerous leaders. But, as the case would soon reveal, the path to convicting Johnny Martinez was riddled with obstacles. Evidence was fragile, built on informants and expert testimony. The same fear that kept witnesses silent also haunted the courtroom, and in time, cracks would appear in the state's case, cracks that threatened to let Martinez slip through the legal net. For now, though, Martinez stood accused as the man who pulled the strings in Robert Rios's murder. From behind prison bars, he had allegedly ordered an execution that sent shockwaves through Orange County. It was a stark reminder of the Mexican Mafia's power. A power that even incarceration could not contain. But as the case moved to trial, the question would shift from who ordered the killing to whether the justice system could prove it. By 2018, Orange County prosecutors were confident they had their man. Johnny Martinez, the imprisoned Mexican Mafia leader, had been charged with murder for orchestrating the killing of Robert Rios. District Attorney Tony Racketeering framed the case as a triumph, proof that even behind bars, shot callers could be held accountable. For Robert Rios's family, it was a moment of hope. Perhaps justice would finally be within reach. But the path from indictment to conviction is never guaranteed. And in a case as complex as this one, involving prison gangs, contraband cell phones, and coded communications, every piece of evidence had to withstand the sharpest legal scrutiny. At the center of the state's case was the testimony of a gang expert. This expert, like many used in prosecutions against organized crime, was called upon to explain the inner workings of the Mexican Mafia, its tax system, its hierarchy, its rules of discipline. For jurors unfamiliar with the shadow world of prison gangs, this testimony was meant to connect the dots. Why would someone like Robert Rios be targeted? How could an inmate like Martinez direct a murder from prison? The gang expert's role was to make the invisible visible. But in the courtroom, that testimony became a point of controversy. Defense attorneys argued that the prosecution's reliance on a single expert created weaknesses. They challenged the reliability of his statements, questioning whether he had overreached, whether his conclusions were supported by evidence, or whether his opinions shaded into speculation. It was a critical blow. Gang experts had long been a cornerstone of California's battle against organized crime. Their testimony had helped send dozens of Mexican Mafia members to prison over the years. But in this case, the judge saw problems. He found the testimony unreliable, a judgment that shook the foundation of the state's prosecution. For Rios's family, the decision was devastating. Years after losing Robert, they now watched as the case against his alleged killer unraveled in court. What had seemed like progress suddenly looked like collapse. This wasn't the first time gang prosecutions in Orange County faced challenges. Critics had long argued that law enforcement sometimes leaned too heavily on experts or cut corners in their eagerness to bring down powerful figures. Defense attorneys accused prosecutors of overreaching, of building cases on shaky ground. And when the court dismissed the murder charges against Martinez in 2022, it reinforced those criticisms. The dismissal wasn't an exoneration. It didn't mean Martinez was innocent, but it did mean the state's case had fallen apart, not because of what happened on the streets of Placentia, but because of what happened in the courtroom. For prosecutors, the setback was more than just one lost case. It highlighted the difficulty of holding prison gang leaders accountable. These men rarely pull the trigger themselves. They operate through layers of intermediaries, whispers, and coded phone calls. Building a clean evidentiary chain that ties them directly to a killing is enormously difficult. And when the legal system falters, it leaves families like the Rioses waiting, wondering if justice will ever come. But the story didn't end with the collapse of the state charges. Instead, it shifted arenas. The federal government, watching closely, was preparing its own strategy. Where the state case had faltered, federal prosecutors believed they had a stronger weapon: the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO. For the moment, Johnny Martinez had escaped a state murder trial. The courtroom battle over gang expert testimony had given him a reprieve. But his story, and Robert Rios's story, was far from over. What began as a murder in Placentia was about to become part of a sweeping federal case against the Mexican Mafia itself. The fight for justice was moving from the local courthouse to the federal arena. When the state murder charges against Johnny Martinez collapsed in 2022, it looked briefly as if the case might fade into the shadows of unresolved gangland violence. But Robert Rios's murder was never going to disappear. Federal investigators had been watching all along, studying the Mexican Mafia's operations with the patience of hunters tracking prey. And now, with the state case in ruins, the federal government stepped in. The killing of Robert Rios was folded into a sweeping federal racketeering indictment, one that went beyond a single murder. Instead of focusing narrowly on Martinez as an individual suspect, prosecutors targeted the Mexican Mafia itself as a criminal organization. This wasn't just about punishing one man, it was about dismantling a system. The legal tool of choice was the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, better known as RICO. Enacted in 1970, RICO was designed to take down the Mafia and other organized crime groups by holding leaders accountable for crimes committed by the organizations they controlled. Under RICO, prosecutors didn't need to prove that Johnny Martinez personally fired the shots that killed Robert Rios. They needed to prove that Rios's murder was part of the Mexican Mafia's criminal enterprise ordered and carried out in furtherance of the gang's operations. This was a crucial shift. In state court, prosecutors had struggled to tie Martinez directly to the killing with admissible evidence. But in federal court, the broader pattern of the Mexican Mafia's activities could be laid out: extortion, drug trafficking, money laundering, and murder, all woven together in a single narrative of organized crime. The federal indictment alleged that Martinez, even while incarcerated, remained a leader within La M's hierarchy. Through contraband phones and loyal associates, he had overseen the flow of money, drugs, and violence. The murder of Robert Rios prosecutors argued, was not an isolated act. It was a business decision, enforcement of the gang's taxation system, designed to protect profits and preserve fear. In federal custody, Martinez faced not just a murder charge, but a web of conspiracy allegations tied to the Mexican Mafia's ongoing criminal operations. If convicted, the penalties would be severe, potentially keeping him behind bars for life, with no chance of slipping through procedural cracks. For Rios's family, the shift to federal court was bittersweet. On one hand, it meant the case wasn't over. The man accused of ordering Robert's death would still face justice. On the other hand, it underscored how fragile the system could be. They had watched charges fall apart once. Now they would wait again, caught in the slow churn of a federal case that could take years to reach trial. The federal government's involvement also reflected a larger reality. Local law enforcement had battled the Mexican Mafia for decades, but the gang's resilience required a national-level response. Federal prosecutors, with their broader reach and tools like RICO, were often better equipped to take on sprawling organizations that blurred the line between prison and street. And this wasn't the first time. Over the years, federal indictments had targeted Mexican Mafia leaders in Los Angeles, San Diego, and beyond. The Rios case became one more chapter in a long war, a reminder that dismantling La EMA required relentless effort across multiple jurisdictions. Meanwhile, Martinez remained behind bars, awaiting trial in federal custody. His name joined a list of defendants accused in the larger racketeering case. For him, the stakes were immense. For Robert Rios's family, the wait for justice continued. And for the community of Placentia, the murder of 2017 still echoed, a warning of how the power of a prison gang could erupt in suburban streets. From state court to federal court, from local homicide to racketeering conspiracy, the case of Johnny Martinez revealed the layers of America's battle with organized crime. Justice for Robert Rios was no longer just about one murder. It had become part of a larger fight, one aimed at striking at the very heart of the Mexican Mafia's empire.